So, David Hoffman, welcome, welcome. You recently put out a book called The Art of Impasse-Breaking, a handbook for mediators, lawyers, and other conflict resolvers. And I identify in one of those. I don't know if you remember, but I think I met you first when I was teaching for David Seibo in a mediation class.
Yes.
And I came up learning about these names, only seeing things that were written, and so it's really an honor to have you. And the first question I want to ask you, that we ask everyone, is what is the story of your name?
Great question. So, David or David is a name I inherited from my great grandfather, my grandmother's father.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tradition in Judaism to name a child after a recently departed ancestor. And I was very pleased to have the name David because my grandmother always spoke so lovingly about
Yeah,
her dad. And Hoffman, I think back in the old country, Eastern Europe,
yeah,
before the turn of the 20th century, in the late 1800s, was Hopfen. And it just, as members of my family passed through Ellis Island, it became Hoffman because some
yeah.
clerk wrote it that way.
Wow.
Yeah.
Does that? I'm curious. My mother's stock comes from vaguely those places that were, depending on the year, Poland, Western Europe, whatever. Um, do you like it? Do you identify more with what you think the original is, or is everything always evolving and you are who you are?
Yeah, I'm fine with Hoffman, and
Yeah,
um, I'm curious about the history,
yeah,
um, and also it's interesting the different naming conventions in different cultures because
hmm
uh, in Judaism, if you named someone after a living relative, that would be considered scandalous and
yeah,
maybe dangerous for that relative. Whereas in other cultures, it's an honor to
yeah.
name a child after a living relative. By
I
the way, when I work with groups and trainings, asking that question I have found is often a wonderful icebreaker
Yeah.
because almost without exception, people have some kind of story or feelings about their name, and it's one way to start seeing people more three dimensionally.
I mean, we're getting right in there. To my mind, I first heard this from Jody Shire when I read The Family Crucible and had something of an understanding that co-facilitation um, might, you could argue, I think in corporate training or like modern day PON stuff, you could say originates from that model. Just to hop right into it. Um, so you write at one point something to the effect of the capacity for mediation to be emotionally or spiritually healing. And I was going to work up to that and talk about more legalese type stuff first, but I think just hopping into it, can you say more about that?
Sure. So I think that the major obstacle in most mediations, the reason why cases reach an impasse, is psychological, emotional. It's,
Haram,
it's
how
not,
dare you say these words?
yes, I mean, it's not true in every case.
Sure.
The motivating factor might be something that's completely dry and businessy.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I was mediating a business case in which the a fairly large company um, said that they were willing to pay more than I thought uh, they valued the case at. And I asked why, and they said, "Well, the other side doesn't know this, but we're trying to position the company for an acquisition or a merger, and this
Get
case
the liability. Yeah.
is a thorn in our side."
Sure.
And so there wasn't really an emotional element to it.
Hmm.
But on the other side of that coin, so to speak, was a case recently involving a company that was very resistant to settlement
Mhm.
because the CEO felt that it was just wrong. It wasn't fair. The plaintiff, whom they had fired,
Yeah.
richly deserved to be fired. And even though they thought they were going to be able to collect the settlement money that
Yeah.
they were paying from their previous law firm's malpractice insurer,
Yeah.
because they had gotten some really bad advice,
Wow.
um, they didn't want to pay even if they were going to be reimbursed
Wow.
because they had such a strong emotional
Horrible.
feeling about fairness.
Yeah. That's
So,
it,
so, so let me jump in with a
yeah,
story
please.
because I think this the story that I'm about to tell is might be a unifying theme in this conversation that we're
Sure.
having. And let me begin by asking you if you know the story of the 18th camel.
It's been a bit.
Okay,
Would love to hear it.
it rings a bell, but
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. So this story is not in the book, but uh, I'm anticipating some time from now a second edition of the book, and I'm going to
Cool.
include this story
Nice.
in it. So the story is about it's an inheritance dispute involving three adult siblings. Their parents have died and left the estate to the three siblings as follows. The oldest of the three gets half, the middle sibling gets a third, and the youngest sibling gets a ninth. And the problem is that the entirety of the parents' estate consists of 17 camels.
Okay.
And they can't figure out how to do the math. And so they call in a mediator to help them solve the problem. And the mediator arrives riding her own camel. And she says, I have a solution for you. I'm going to donate my camel to your parents' estate. So you'll have 18 camels. And now the oldest will get half of 18, which is nine. And the middle child will get a third of 18, which is six. And the youngest will get one ninth, which is two. And they scratch their heads and they say, wow, yeah, that works. And then they add up nine and six and two, and it comes
Yeah.
out to 17. And so they give the 18th camel back to the mediator.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
So
It's beautiful.
now this story comes from Iran, of all places, from
Wow.
an Iranian philosopher of the 1700s. And Bill Urey brought this story into the
Yes.
culture of mediation and negotiation
Yep.
in his book, Getting Past No. And he also told the story in a TED talk that he did.
Mm.
And I love the story because the math element of it is that if you add up a half and a third and a ninth, there's an unallocated portion, one
Yeah.
18th of the estate,
Right.
that's not allocated.
Yeah.
And the mediators saw that there was some surplus value there and figured out a way for the three siblings to see the surplus value and unlock the puzzle. So the reason I tell the story is that I think whether you're looking at the business obstacle to settlement or the psychological obstacle to settlement, what
Mm.
we're always looking for is that 18th camel,
Yeah.
which is the key that opens the door to resolution.
Can you imagine what lending an 18th camel would look like for the listener or in society, or maybe more specifically for a mediator?
Yeah, so I'll tell a story that involves an emotional um, element of
I'll get
the
my tissues. Okay. Yep.
18th camel. Yeah. So it was a case involving, uh, again, an inheritance dispute, but a modern day inheritance dispute
Hmm.
involving an uncle and his niece. And they had sadly lost
Yeah.
the uncle's sister, the niece's mom, to cancer.
Mm.
And about 3 years had passed. And the reason they were in my office for mediation is that the uncle, who was a lawyer, had badly mismanaged the estate, hadn't invested the funds, hadn't distributed funds, and the niece had been writing to him, calling him, emailing him, trying to get his attention. And he was depressed. He completely dropped the ball, and
Yeah.
it was costly.
Yeah.
And at the very beginning of the mediation, he apologized. They both were represented by counsel, but
Okay.
we had some face-to-face meetings, and he apologized. And she said, "Well, I appreciate your apology, but that's not going to, solve this."
Right.
And by the end of the day, they had negotiated the money part of the case, but there were two other parts of the case that represented the 18th camel from the standpoint of
Okay.
closure. The uncle was very concerned that his niece would report him to the Board of Bar Overseers, and he very much needed his law license to make a living, support his family. And
Yeah.
he realized that he was at some risk. He also knew that there was nothing he could put in a settlement agreement that would be enforceable that would bar his niece from filing a complaint
Yeah.
with the Board of Bar Overseers. And he was hesitant to bring it up because he thought, I don't want to give her ideas that maybe
Right.
she doesn't already have. On the
Yeah.
other hand, he felt very nervous. And the other thing he wanted was some kind of family reconciliation.
Yeah.
And so I asked him if he'd like to meet just one on one with his niece, with me present or without me present. He said, I'd like you to be there. The lawyers don't need to be there. And the niece said, fine. We met in my office. And he said, you know, it would really mean a lot to me if we could become family, resume being family together.
Yeah.
And if you could, and he started to say, forgive. And he didn't even finish the word before she put up her hand like this. And I thought, uh-oh, here comes
Oh
trouble.
no.
She's clearly not receptive to this.
Yeah.
And she put up her hand and she said, I've already forgiven you.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
uh, with that,
Wow.
he got teary,
Yeah.
and she got teary, and he said, and I hate to ask you this, but I'm worried about my law license. And she said, I'm not going to file anything. And they hugged, and it was one of those happy ending
Yeah.
mediations.
Yeah.
And so the 18th camel was creating a space where they could have that kind of emotional exchange, because having the lawyers in the room would have
Yeah.
complicated it. And
Yep.
it also required kind of prepping the uncle for having the courage to ask
Yeah.
about
Name it.
what he most wanted.
Yeah.
So I think whether it's emotional or it's a business issue, figuring out what's the stuck place, the thing that people really need to achieve closure,
Mm.
and that's what we mediators need to be attuned to, especially when there's an impasse.
I'm wondering if you feel like there are distinct advantages and disadvantages of being a lawyer and a mediator versus a
Mm.
mediator who's not a lawyer. Is there anything in that legal training that helps or hurts?
Well, it depends on the case. I mean, for
Yeah.
example, I'm going to be mediating a case this coming weekend involving a family whose dad is in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And the issues are not really financial. They're a question of how much autonomy should he have, and how much should the kids kind of take over decision making for
Yeah.
dad. And the siblings have different views about that. Um, I don't think my law degree helps much. It might help a little bit. There might be some utility there, but primarily the skills of a mental health professional would probably be more relevant, especially somebody who's done a lot of work in elder care.
Yeah.
On the other hand, mediating the employment termination case that I described a few minutes ago, There were a lot of legal dimensions to
Sure.
that for which my legal training was helpful.
Maybe a more specific question in the model rules of conduct for an attorney. I'm wondering about how the client principle, how the fairness principle, and how the public principle might clash, especially in a family type of situation.
Well, do you want to give me an example of a
Yeah,
situation where you see
sure.
those principles in conflict?
Yeah, so a family, parents are divorcing. One parent confides to attorney that they're not fit in some way. It's just not the best interest of the child. So, in terms of public principle, um, but asks the attorney not to say anything,
Hmm.
would be one thing, and probably a material in its omission, a material misrepresentation, um, a fact. So,
So are you positing a situation where a parent is seeking parenting time and maybe shared custody, even though maybe they admit to the mediator that they have a drinking problem or a drug
yeah,
addiction or something like that? Yeah, I mean,
yes,
yeah. So this is exactly the kind of, ethics dilemma that my co-teacher Audrey Lee and I present to
Audrey, that's right.
Yes, in the mediation course that we teach at Harvard Law School. And, the dilemma is uh, autonomy and self determination,
Mm,
on the one hand. But then there's informed consent on the other parent perhaps doesn't know about this admission. And then you have
right.
the, you might call it a public interest, but it's the child's interest, the interest of a vulnerable third party. And those interests clearly are in tension in the
Yeah,
hypothetical that you offered. And the model uh, standards of conduct for mediators, uh, they don't provide a hierarchy of those ethics responsibilities.
mm,
On the other hand, I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that when you're dealing with vulnerable third parties, uh, who don't have a voice in the
yeah,
mediation, the mediator probably should say to the parent who's suffering from some kind of impairment that you can't continue this mediation. You're not going
right,
to be complicit
right.
in the negotiation of a parenting arrangement that's potentially very harmful to a vulnerable third party.
Mm,
And so, what I have found, this doesn't come up very often, but when a conflict of this kind comes up, when I say to the person who wants me to keep the secret, I'm going to have to withdraw, they understand that the mediator's withdrawal without an explanation to the other side is going to raise questions.
sure.
And they typically agree to make the disclosure that needs to be made, and and then we can move forward.
Mm. I have so many questions for you. Um, One here would be my understanding you write in the book that in 2016 you swore off litigation.
Mhm.
And you did a TED talk as well, on lawyers as peacemakers, exclamation mark, question mark. And I'd love to hear more about all of that.
Sure. So for many years uh, prior to 2016, I was noticing how many of my colleagues, particularly those in family law, were choosing to not do litigation anymore. They
Mm,
participated as settlement counsel, they participated as mediators, arbitrators, but going to court, they decided was just not something they were willing to do any longer. And the most vivid description of the reason for that decision came from a fellow family law attorney. Now, my practice has been family, business, and employment, and other areas, including construction and insurance. Um, but this particular colleague, Dan Finn, was doing exclusively family law. And he said, I asked him, why did he decide to stop litigation? And he said, well, he said, I came back from court one day realizing that it had been my job to say to the judge that he said I was representing a husband, heterosexual marriage, the parties getting a divorce.
Mm.
My job was to persuade the judge that the wife was a worse person than she really was,
Yeah.
and persuade the judge that my client was a better person than he really was. And he said it felt morally like a moral compromise.
Sure.
And he decided, I don't want to do that anymore. And he was very active in the collaborative law movement. And um, I thought that his little story vividly illustrated one of the things that made me feel uncomfortable about going to court. But looking at it more broadly, in the legal profession, we have a need for litigators. There are test cases. There are, some cases that just have to go to trial. There are bet the company cases. There are cases where you need a judicial decision about the validity of a patent
Mm.
because you can't arrive at that by private agreement because you want
Yeah.
something that's going to, bind the whole world. And this is not a criticism of litigators, but if you map the allocation of roles in the legal profession onto, say, medicine, where you have, internal medicine practitioners and you
Yep.
have surgeons. Um, if you had a medical system that was mostly surgeons, we'd have a lot more surgery. That's one thing, but we
Yeah.
might have more surgery than we need. And in a legal system that has such an abundance of litigators, we probably have more litigation than we really need. And having growing the ranks of lawyers who do only settlement negotiations.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like the division in the UK where you have solicitors and barristers.
Mm.
The barristers are a distinct minority among members of the bar in the UK. And I think our legal system would actually be enhanced if we had more general practitioners
Mm.
uh, and reserve the precious court time for
Yep.
cases that truly need to be tried.
Amen. How do we do that?
Well, one of the things is training lawyers and making it a routine part of the training of lawyers
Yeah.
in negotiation, mediation.
Yeah.
And so people coming out of law school will not only understand what those concepts are about, but also have hands-on experience doing it.
Yeah.
And if we build it, then they'll come. Is sort of
Yeah.
the
Feel the
concept.
um I'm not sure. I'm sure you've seen, I think it's Dr. Larry Schooler's work on like the psychometric profile of lawyers or attorneys against the national population, like higher than average in urgency,
Hmm.
skepticism, autonomy, abstract thinking,
Hmm.
significantly lower than the average population in resilience, so bouncing back from
Hmm.
adverse effect, and sociability. And when I think about the things that you write in the book, internal family systems, understanding the self, et cetera, or even those horrid words you used, like with feelings and psychology and emotional, and even daring to criticize classical economics with behavioral economics and loss aversion, et cetera. Um, my question is this, which is how do you make what you're saying, which I am completely with, um, more commonplace in culture? And I'm hearing you saying that to some extent, part of an American legal education ought to include that with real experience. But I'm also wondering about is it the effect of a legal education or is it who goes to law school? And the reason I ask more specifically is because there was I don't know how recent the study was, but it said that it measured first year law students or students who had yet to have ethics training and then students who had had it. And it seemed in these hypothetical dilemmas, like one of the ones I mentioned, that they were more likely to engage in what we wouldn't call good contact for the sake of the client principle and zealous advocacy after they had taken ethics, which is to say, at least in my mind, one conclusion might be um, that all things being fair and equal, having made the calculation of how hard it would be to be held accountable. I don't know. I'm just wondering what you make of that and how we make the lawyers that I hope we make.
A really interesting question. So, I think part of the problem is that law has made a shift from being what was sometimes referred to as one of the learned professions to
Mm,
being more of a business.
mm,
And I think this is a failure of self regulation of the bar. Um, the It's also perhaps a failure of um, social regulation of the bar.
mm,
Uh, and the Our society could, for example, decide that everyone is entitled to a lawyer, not just before their liberty can be taken away, which is
mm.
now a guaranteed constitutional right. Though, when you look at the rate that public defenders are paid
Yeah,
and the huge backlog in uh, getting lawyers for indigent defendants, even that constitutional right
right,
is observed in the breach.
right.
But our system allows people to be evicted from their homes or deprived of governmental benefits or fired from their employment or denied educational opportunities without legal representation, even under circumstances where typically the employer, the landlord, the government official, uh, they have lawyers at their
Yep,
beck and call.
yep,
And the right to legal representation is something that our society, our legislatures have not made a priority.
right.
And therefore, for example, in divorce, your children can be taken away from you by, an order of the probate and family court, and you have no legal representation, nor was a lawyer appointed for the children. The
Yep.
court has the power to appoint a lawyer for the children, but it doesn't happen very often. And at least two-thirds of the divorce cases in our courts involve one or both parties not having lawyers.
Mm,
So, in some societies, lawyers are not paid as much as the average lawyer makes in the United States, but there is more availability. And so that's a choice society has made.
mm,
But it's also problematic from the standpoint of what lawyers are doing,
yeah.
because lawyers could donate more pro bono time. They
Mm,
could contribute more from the coffers of the law firms to legal services organizations.
mm,
Um, and um, and I think that, as I mentioned earlier, more training for lawyers. Put it
yeah.
on the bar exam, for example. More
Hmm.
training in mediation and negotiation
Yeah.
would increase the utilization of those uh, less expensive ways of resolving conflict.
Hmm. I'm wondering, so I'm thinking about like Pareto optimality, and you said a few things that I want to touch on. So I'll give you options wherever you'd like to go. One, I'm curious what social regulation of the bar looks like, practically speaking. Um, and the other thing I'm thinking about is Pareto optimality and how to inculcate in a mediator, lawyer, whomever it is, an understanding of more than like a two-dimensional axis, like graph, if that makes sense, which is not just us and them, but also the public. So
Hmm.
thinking about the possibility of 18th, 19th, 20th camels, I'm thinking about pro-social negotiation, or a term that I'm playing with is conflict emissions or negotiation emissions, which affect the people around them. Like how much does the divorce ripple throughout the
Hmm.
rest of the family, right? How much does the employment tear apart the company itself, right?
Right.
Things that we know are destructive, and I'm wondering about that inculcation again, with the fear that I'm wondering if people go through the negotiation workshop at Harvard, do we know that they're better because of it?
Hmm. Well, that's a great question. And I don't know of any sociological study that has measured those kinds of externalities,
Mm,
society wide externalities from conflict. But it's not hard to imagine that, at least within some range of relationships and connections in a family system and a community that divorces have, and especially divorces that are handled badly,
Yeah.
have a negative impact that extends out several um, degrees of separation from the couple. Um, but let me go back to one part of your question, which is, well, what would social regulation of the
Yeah.
bar look like? And I also want to connect that with conflict resolution
Yeah.
and mediation in particular. So the American Bar Association has ethics rules that are not self-enforcing. States have to adopt them. And one of the ethics rules, it's the only one in the ABA model rules of professional conduct, the only rule that says should instead of shall. All the other rules say you shall do this, you shall not do that.
Huh.
This one says should, meaning it's not mandatory.
Yeah.
It's the rule about pro bono hours.
Okay.
And it says lawyers should devote 50
Ah.
pro bono hours. And the um, and some states have made that mandatory. Massachusetts is not one of them.
Mm.
But the idea that 50 hours a year would be adequate, contribution to the public good, I
Yeah.
think is paltry. The fact that it's not, uh, it can't be used, at least under the ABA rules, to discipline a lawyer. That's
Mm.
both a failure of self-regulation because the bar could, change that. It's also
Yeah.
a failure of social regulation because the licensing authorities, which are governed by our court system
Mm.
and to some degree by our legislature, um, could impose higher standards of pro bono service. Likewise, the use of mediation could be publicly funded. It receives public funding in Massachusetts
Yeah.
of the to the tiniest degree, uh, and in some states not at all. There are no states that I'm aware of that amply fund conflict resolution, and so that's a failure of on the part of our society generally and our legislatures in particular. And part of the problem is there isn't a large organized constituency lobbying for and advocating for the funding
Mm.
of mediation services, the same to anywhere near the degree that public legal services are funded. And even those, as we were discussing a moment ago,
Yeah.
are funded only to a paltry degree.
Hmm. There's so many lovely things in this book. I really feel like I'm cheating a little bit in reading it. It's like, here are my 33 years of insights. I had no idea what bracketed negotiation was, all these processes and tools, the fishy calculator, like, which is like a numerical one text almost. So many things. It feels like cheat codes. So first of all, thank you. Second of all, you talk about a specific moment that I've seen in small claims court, not outside of it, of there being a ZOPA, a zone of possible agreement, or the absence of a ZOPA, but a really narrow one that's kind of comical in relation to like the total settlement, potential settlement amount, and having a third party, whether it's the mediator or an attorney. Um, I'm going to use the word shame, but feel free to push on it. Shame the people by offering to close that gap. So I saw this in small claims court. The guy was just like, "Hey, it was a divorce. It was pretty acrimonious. I think the amount was something like $500 or maybe something small." Guy was like, "You know what? I'll pay it." And they're like, they got embarrassed. They said, "No, no, 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 we'll do it," which was great because it took, it was like an 18th camel, right? Except there never was an 18th camel.
Right.
Um, so what I want to ask, because I really like your realistic, pragmatic approach to mediation. Some would talk about, I'd love if you could talk about a little bit about the potential oxymoron of an evaluative mediator, um, and or what some of the questions are around doing something like that, which I think you said you did once, but might not ever do again.
Yes, uh, I think in the case that's described in the book, I said, I'm tempted to offer to close the gap with a reduction of my own fee, and
Mhm.
the lawyers jumped in and said, no, no,
Yeah.
we're not going to do that. So, as you point out, it's sort of an illusory 18th camel,
Mm.
but because I didn't actually offer it, I said I was thinking about it, or I was tempted to do it. I don't think my firm would have been very happy about
Right.
my doing that.
Yeah.
But in any event, um, the um, the idea of being a quote evaluative or directive, mediator, uh, being sort of anathema to the people who practice facilitative mediation,
Mm.
is a big, complicated topic that is much debated within our field, as you know.
Yeah.
And I guess what I would say is that most of the mediators I know who do this for a living are quite eclectic. And I think that being evaluative is not very useful when the parties are very sophisticated, they have very sophisticated and experienced lawyers. They're not that interested, in my opinion. They know
Mm.
the case much better than I do.
Mm.
They've spent more time litigating cases perhaps than I have, though have I had quite a few years. I was a litigator for 31 years. Um, so I know a little bit about how courts do things, and I clerked
Yeah.
for a year, which is great experience to see the world
Wow.
from the vantage point of the judge.
Yeah.
Um, but so I think I can add some value there, but in some cases, not so much. And the question that I'm asking myself when I'm trying to figure out where's the 18th camel here is, do they need case evaluation? Do they need a mediator's proposal? Do they need range bargaining? Do they need, a fishy calculator? What is the need? Because I think saying, I don't do evaluation, okay, there's some people who feel like, I don't, I'm not a lawyer, or I'm a lawyer, but I don't spend much time in courts. I don't feel I'm well qualified
Mm.
to give you a case evaluation. Well,
Yeah.
that's fine. There are plenty of other tools in the toolbox besides that one.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and I often find that um, when I say to lawyers, look, there's a gap here. I wonder if it would be helpful to bring in a retired judge to
Hmm.
provide us with a case evaluation.
Yeah.
They typically say, no, we've already got too many cooks in the kitchen. We've already spent all this money educating you about the case. And sometimes they'll say, why don't you do the case evaluation? I say, okay, well, if I do that, there's a risk that I'll be seen as taking sides,
Sure.
and then I lose my effectiveness as a mediator. And I would say in recent years, more often they don't want case evaluation, but if they're really stuck, they want a mediator's proposal. And that's one of the most well worn tools in my
Mm.
toolbox. Um, and I'm sure you know what the ground rules are, but I'll explain it to anybody who's
Please.
listening,
Yeah.
to the people listening to your podcast. It's a double blind process in which the mediator, having worked with the parties, having a sense of their resistance to settlement or their eagerness for settlement in certain ranges,
Mm.
the mediator makes a proposal by request from the parties, makes it separately in each of the two rooms or three if there are three parties, but more often it's two. And then after hearing their response to the mediator's proposal, the mediator doesn't report anything unless there are two yeses. If there are two yeses, the mediator reports that the case is settled.
Mm.
But if there's a yes and a no, or a no and a yes, or two no's, the mediator just says no settlement.
Hmm.
So there are two advantages to this approach. One is that it empowers and maybe encourages the parties to consider saying yes, because the other side won't know they said yes unless they too said yes.
Mm.
So they can do it more. They can do it more safely.
It's a
And
simultaneous game in that
it's a
way.
simultaneous game. That's right. Exactly right. The second thing is that because the proposal is coming from a third party, it reduces the cognitive bias of reactive devaluation,
Yep.
which is that if one side makes a proposal, even if it's in your zone of possible agreement,
Must be something
you
up with it.
what's the catch?
Yeah.
What do they know that I don't know? Why
Yep.
are they being so reasonable all of a sudden? Whereas the mediator's proposal lands without any apparent agenda, and hopefully no agenda at all, other than trying to help the parties find their way to a resolution.
Mm.
And so it tends to be successful in my experience, 80 to 90% of the
Wow.
cases where we use it.
Wow. There are so many components of design. Um, would it be overly reductive to say that so much of mediation is about helping people save face and hear each other? Is that overly reductive?
No, I don't think that's overly reductive. I think those are two huge components. And I think that the opportunity to feel heard and seen and understood is one that sometimes we can achieve across the table.
Mm,
But just as often, at least in the cases I'm involved in, it's being deeply seen and heard and understood by the mediator
mm,
because the parties may not want to be in the same room together.
mm,
And so the question is, will they come away from the mediation feeling validated,
mm,
at least by the mediator, if not by the other side?
mm. Um, you are one of the first, maybe one of the few people who talks about internal family systems in the
Mm-hmm.
context that in which you reside. Like in Harvard Law, that is not the first thing I think about, though I think a lot of the workshop itself derives from it, from Cambridge area family therapist, IPS, as psychodrama, Gestalt, all that. What makes you effective in doing that? And what are you still working on in terms of having things take root? And by things, I mean the type of pro social attorneys that we hope to create and the
Mm-hmm.
collaborative law movement.
Yeah, great question. Um, so let me just say a word first about internal
Please.
family systems. It's a
Yeah.
psychological model that was developed in the 1980s by Dr. Richard Schwartz, and it was developed for use in psychotherapy.
Mm,
It's all about parts. The idea that we have parts that carry around our wounds. We call those exiles,
mm,
and we have manager parts that try to keep those wounded parts from being re-stimulated and re-injured. And then we have reactive, we call them firefighter parts, that step in to uh, deal with trouble when someone breaks through our managerial defense system
yeah.
and counterattacks or distracts us from the pain that we're feeling. And those firefighter reactions, whether it's anger or uh, reaching for a drink to dampen the flames of these stirred up exiles,
Sure.
are typically not socially approved techniques.
Yep.
But their reaction is, hey, the manager's dropped the ball here. And by any means necessary, we're going
Yep.
to deal with the situation.
Numb it. Distract. Yep.
Numb it, distract. And in mediation, when someone pushes the other party's buttons, counterattack. And a strong defense, it becomes a good offense. And so we see these parts getting stimulated a lot in the mediation room. And it turns out that this IFS model can be applied in other settings, law, mediation, teaching, coaching, and other settings beyond that. Not from the standpoint of how therapists would go in to try to heal those wounded exiles, but rather how to manage the managers,
Yeah.
the managerial parts, the firefighter parts more successfully so that people can relax their defense systems and negotiate more successfully.
Mm,
Um, so I got interested in this in 2010. my late wife Beth was a
Mm.
psychotherapist, and she
That's
got trained in the IFS model in 2008, and she was very excited about it. And she became a trainer herself,
cool.
and then I got invited by the Harvard Negotiation Law Review symposium in 2010. The topic was the negotiation within.
Mm.
And I had no idea what I was going to say. And then we say in New England, light dawned on Marblehead.
That's where I
I
grew up. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
I grew up.
It's a
I Yep.
yes. So that's the first place in Massachusetts where we see the dawn, I think.
Yeah.
But
We'd like
uh,
to think so.
yes, and so the light bulb finally turned on, and I thought, oh, the negotiation within. That's what my wife Beth has been talking
Wow.
about. I
Yep.
need to read up on this. So I participated in the symposium and gave a talk about internal family systems. And it's kind of a misnomer. Dick Schwartz, if he were in this podcast room with us, would readily acknowledge that back in the 1980s, when he created this model, he probably should have called it the internal systems model, not the internal family systems. He was a family therapist.
Hmm.
And what he was describing were the family like relationships that
Yep.
these managers, firefighters, and exiles have with each other,
Sure.
just like in a family,
Yeah.
complicated, family
Yeah.
system. And so the internal family systems model, not about families, it's about individuals
Yeah.
and the complex negotiation within. So there are basically four ways that I see the applicability for us mediators
Mm.
and lawyers as well. So the first one is, how well do we understand our own parts? And to what extent can we foster self leadership? Self energy is sort of the
Yeah.
core seat of consciousness that we have that notices these different parts and can help be a mediator with these parts so that we can be more authentic and integrated and less reactive and defensive. So, number one, we can be more effective as mediators if our parts are not all jangly and,
Hmm.
competing for the steering wheel, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Second, um, if we can understand better the parts that are in conflict and tension with our clients, we are, I think, better able to have compassion for them, understanding of their situation,
Mm.
and not be as so judgy about them. It's a very common thing for lawyers and mediators to be judgy about the clients that we work with because we see the solution, right? Why
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
they see the solution?
Yeah.
You know, there's a good reason why they don't see the solution. And the IFS model, unlike the traditional therapeutic model, which says what's wrong with this person, the
Yes.
IFS model says what happened to this person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a more humane question,
Mm.
actually. And so number one, self understanding and self management. Number two, client understanding and client compassion. Number three, the
Mm.
model, if we share it with the clients, it may help them understand and have more compassion for the party they're in conflict with and
Mm.
see them more three dimensionally and be less reactive. And
Yeah.
then the fourth way this model can be useful is if both parties have an understanding of parts and how their parts trigger each other and
Yeah.
create, escalation.
Hmm.
We can actually get them in real time to take a step back. So, for example, sometimes if I notice people are, raising their voices, pointing the finger of blame at each other, um, I'll say, it seems like your gladiator parts have taken over the conversation.
Hmm. Nice.
And there's
Nice.
nothing wrong with having gladiator parts. We all
Parts.
need
Yep.
them from time to time.
Not all
But
of you.
I'm just wondering if you could invite your gladiator parts to take a step back and create a little more space at the table here
Yeah. Yep.
for your problem solving parts, because the problem solving parts are likely to be the ones that are going to get us to a resolution.
Yeah.
And you can tell those gladiator parts just to step back and watch what's going on. If they're needed, you can call them to the fore.
Yeah.
And people, I don't have to teach them a whole psychological model. I can just give them that metaphor. And I'll just
Yeah.
say one further thing,
Please.
a metaphor that I think is really useful. One of the most common experiences that we have in mediation is working with people who are ambivalent
Hmm.
about settling. There's a part of them that wants to fight the good fight, and a
Yeah.
part of them that realizes it would be practical to resolve it. And so they need to do that negotiation within. And now that I have more understanding of this model, I've developed the courage to say to people, it sounds like a part of you is really wanting to fight for fairness here.
Yep.
And another part of you is concerned about the costs of
Hmm.
fighting for fairness and
Yeah.
wants to be practical. And I say to people, I think we all have a mediator inside us that can help
Yes.
us make a wise choice and listen to these parts and
Yeah.
come up with, a solution. And
Hmm.
people, it's a very easy metaphor to grasp.
Yeah.
And I find that people are open, not everybody, but
Yeah.
many people are open to experiencing their ambivalence
Yep.
and their difficulties with conflict using that metaphor. It's very empowering because I'm
Yeah.
not trying to twist their arm
Right.
to settle
I
the
see you,
case.
and I see your parts. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And makes people feel even more seen, heard, and understood.
Yeah. Um, First, I want to be mindful of your time. I could ask you, I have so many more questions for you. And when your next book or second edition comes out, I want to ask you about Murray Bowen, triangles, all these types of things. I'm wondering if just to end, so first of all, again, it's the art of impasse breaking and mediation. Where can people find this this cheat sheet from your career?
Yes. So the American Bar Association books, they published it, and people can buy it directly from the ABA. And if they are members of the ABA, and in particular members of the dispute resolution section of the ABA, there's a discount. It's also available through Amazon, Kindle, and we shouldn't forget our local bookstores.
That's
Local
yes, that's right.
bookstores, they may not be carrying it on their shelves, but they can order it.
Yep.
And I strongly believe in supporting our local bookstores.
Buy this book from your local bookstore. Um, David, I aspire to the sagacity. I aspire really to the calm that you have. And I think just as a final question, you I think on this IFS kind of idea, and I like internal systems better, and that's a very helpful clarification. And I kind of envision if you haven't already written something that's the mediator within, I'm kind of thinking about, I think it's Eric Ariel Fox does Winning from Within and uses kind of Jungian archetypes via C-suite. So like there's your internal CEO. And when I hear you say the self-led or mediator within, I think about allowing your executive functioning to take the lead while still, well, frankly, mediating amongst your parts. You give an example in the book. I think it's one of the later chapters, something about like conflict as sport and how it's particularly hard when you see people who like, I just love this stuff. Like, I don't know if it's sadistic, but we have met those people. I think you say they're few and far between, but when you meet them and that they're, for lack of a better term, triggering to you in a way. And you have a very beautiful way of putting it very simply, like basically one must do their best to try to whatever. I heard kind of like going to the balcony, and I'm just wondering if you can describe for people who might struggle more, who identify that they're upset or angry or something bothers them, especially mediators, what you do in that situation in terms of, do I hide it? Do I try and push it down? Does that mean I'm not ready to mediate? How, how do you move from a place of being angry at this effing person to a place of one should really show them the compassion we would want to be shown?
Yeah. So um, the kind of person that you mentioned, and as you indicated, I very seldom run into them, but every now and then, someone who really enjoys
Mm,
uh, the litigation process.
mm.
Um, I think the internal systems model uh,
Yeah.
provides a useful tool. and because the that person might have a number of parts that are in play, um, and one of them is the I enjoy seeing how these things work out, and I like the feeling that I can, you feel powerful and influence, the outcome.
Yeah.
And then I also want to appeal to the just get curious about the part of them that's concerned about the externalities. Like,
Mm.
what impact does it have on your uh, professional reputation as a business person or as a lawyer, to be seen as someone who does actually enjoy, this process. And the person might say, "Well, uh, yeah, there's a part of me that is concerned about that, but a much bigger part just enjoys the sport of it." Well,
Mm.
okay. Um, and what about the person on the other side? Do you have any concerns? Is there a part of you that's concerned about them?
Mm.
And you know, basically, I'm fishing. I'm fishing for what parts within the system
Mhm.
are uh, in tension with each other, and
Mm.
how to come up with a wise choice. And sometimes just modeling compassion for that person,
Mm.
and compassion for the person on the other side of the case, just being authentically present
Yeah.
and concerned, can bring down the temperature and can create some support and validity for the part of this person that actually does have compassion,
Mm.
and feels like uh, they want to be fair. So I have to just explore what is going on in that person's system. I'll leave you with one story. And because often in mediation, our mental model is how can we achieve understanding where people really, and as I said earlier, I think often that's not going to be possible,
Mm.
but it is possible for people to see the light of their own experience and their own meaning, their own values. And I saw that in a case which is described in the book about a whistleblower who had been complaining about ethics violations in a private company, big corporation that he worked for. And the company kept looking into these alleged ethics violations, and they didn't think there was anything there.
Mm.
And they put him on notice. They said, if you keep filing these, ethics complaints that turn out not to be well founded, we're going to terminate your employment.
Mm.
And he kept doing it. They fired him. And so he said that his termination was unlawful because it was in violation of public policy. And there is a doctrine that supports that theory. The question is whether the facts supported that theory.
Mm.
And I have to say, I think the company probably had the better of that argument. And the parties were really far apart because the employee was really dug in. When I looked at his resume, which was part of the case file, I noticed that he'd been in the Army for 20 years and then retired, as people often do
Mm.
after 20 years. And I said, what was your experience in the Army like? Were you in combat? Where did you serve? And he told me the story of his 20 years of service. And I could see how animated he was and how much he valued the time that he spent serving our country. And he said, in the Army, the great thing about being in the Army was that people turned square corners. You could count on them to follow the rules because if they didn't, everybody's life was going to be in danger.
Mhm.
And he said, I come into the corporate world and it seems like anything goes.
Yeah. Wow.
People don't play by the rules.
Yep.
And that light that dawned on Marblehead, I saw the light turn on, and he said, "You know what?" He said, "I think I wound up in the wrong place,
Wow.
and I think I'd be better off in an environment where the rules are clear and people follow them."
Yeah.
And with that, the case pretty quickly resolved.
Mm.
And so mediation can be an opportunity for transformative experiences like the uncle and the niece that I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
or like the retired, soldier, whistleblower, who saw in a new light his experience and the challenges that he faced in this conflict.
Yeah.
And I think when people come away from a mediation feeling more empowerment, more self determination, more agency, more understanding, uh, more being heard and understood,
Mm,
that's adding value, which has its own ripple effects.
mm,
And hopefully,
mm,
our work as peacemakers can have that kind of reverberation in the
mm.
larger world.
Well, the art of impasse breaking and mediation is for sure an amplification of that reverberation, and your work is so inspiring. And thank you so much for taking the time to not just talk about it, but for sharing it with all of us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. Thanks, David.